Hello, and welcome to the fifth lecture on William Shakespeare's Hamlet. This is the fifth lecture in a series of 12 lectures altogether. And remember, if you watch all 12 lectures, you earn an extra credit point. Let's begin today by returning to the moment in the play when Hamlet is speaking with his childhood friends, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. And this is Act 2, Scene 2. In your anthologies, I'm on page 1428. That's page 1428. And recall that Rosencrantz and Guildenstern have been called to court. The king and queen wish to use Rosencrantz and Guildenstern to discover why Hamlet is behaving so erratically. Why is he brooding? Why is he so melancholy? And they've asked Rosencrantz and Guildenstern to find out, without letting Hamlet know what they're doing. So Hamlet, at first, when he first greets his friends, he's enthusiastic. He's excited to see them. But if you recall, very quickly he grows suspicious. He becomes doubtful and he suspects that his friends have been sent for. And he presses the issue. And finally, Guildenstern at line 287, he admits, "My lord, we were sent for." And Hamlet responds, Hamlet tells them, "Well, I'll tell you why I've been behaving so oddly. That way you won't have to let the king and queen know that I discovered that you were sent for, that you're here to essentially spy on me." So here we have the famous passage, one of the famous passages from the play that begins at line 293. Hamlet tells his friends, "I have of late, but wherefore I know not, lost all my mirth, forgone all custom of exercises, and indeed it goes so heavily with my disposition, that this goodly frame the earth seems to me a sterile promontory. This most excellent canopy the air, look you, this brave overhanging firmament, this majestical roof fretted with golden fire, why it appeareth nothing to me but a foul and pestilent congregation of vapors." Hamlet tells them that of late he's lost all his mirth, and this is true. He says he doesn't know why. Uh, this is partly true. I think, remember, many of Hamlet's inner conflicts he's unaware of, but he certainly does resent Claudius for having ascended to the throne, and he's disgusted with the behavior of his mother, Gertrude, for her having so quickly forgotten his father, the elder King Hamlet, after his death. And so he does, to some extent, understand why he has lost all his mirth. Um, Notice the metaphors here. Again, this brings to mind one of the causes, one of the deterministic features for Hamlet's delay in seeking vengeance, and that would be his disillusionment with this world, with this earth. Uh, he says, "This goodly frame, the earth." That metaphor of a goodly frame suggests that formerly Hamlet had an idealized view of the world. Remember, as a romantic, he believes that the universe exhibits design, that there is a Christian God who has planned the universe, and that there is a design, there is a meaning for its existence. And the goodly frame suggests something that's been designed, something that's been constructed. He says, "Now this goodly frame, the earth, seems to me a sterile promontory." He no longer can understand. He no longer sees a design operating in the universe, a purpose or a plan. Uh, all is chaos to him. There doesn't seem to be any moral order permeating the universe. No justice, no fairness. That's how he's seeing it now. And he continues, this most excellent canopy, again, a canopy, once more suggesting the metaphor here, suggesting something that is framed, that is designed, that is planned. Look you, this brave o'erhanging firmament, this majestical roof, fretted with gold and fire. And again, that metaphor, a roof, once more, something that has been built, something that has been constructed with a purpose in mind. This majestical roof fretted with golden fire, why it appeareth nothing to me but a foul and pestilent congregation of vapors. No purpose can he detect any longer, no intention here. It's a foul and pestilent congregation of vapors. Hamlet is lost in a kind of fog, isn't he? He's experiencing experiencing the chaos, and he's in a kind of miasma of despair, and he can't see his way. He can't find any reason for uh, uh, what has occurred on Earth. Uh, in Denmark here, remember Claudius has gained power, and Claudius, in Hamlet's mind, is representative of the force of evil, if you will. Remember Hamlet's romantic vision. So he can't find a purpose any longer. Some critics argue that Hamlet here has lost his faith. Um, I would say that he still holds to a romantic vision. He still believes that the universe has a design, and he still believes in the Christian God. But his faith, he does have moments of doubt. He does have moments where his faith wavers because he simply can't understand why uh, unfairness. Uh, there is this unfairness in the world. And remember, within the context of faith, it's it's for many people, it's easy for them to doubt because faith, a faith-based belief, is one that lacks any proof, any support, any evidence. So it's many people of faith experience throughout their lives moments of doubt, moments where they are unsure. And that's probably, I would imagine, what's happening with Hamlet here. I don't think there's any evidence in the play to indicate that he ever loses his faith in his romantic vision, that he ever loses his faith in the Christian God's existence. And then he says here, he turns to this idea of man, of human beings. And he says, what a piece of work is a man, how noble in reason, how infinite in faculties, in form and moving, how express and admirable, in action, how like an angel, in apprehension, how like a god, the beauty of the world, the paragon of animals. And yet to me, what is this quintessence of dust? So here again, uh, Hamlet he can't seem to he can't understand, he can't fathom why human beings come to this tragic end. It seems to be absurd to him, this idea that human beings have, uh, well, this is really a romantic view of human beings, isn't it? The idea that they are the beauty of the world and the paragon of animals. You can certainly see Hamlet's bias here, his prejudice when it comes to human beings. But the idea that um, humans have the ability to act like angels and to apprehend like gods, and yet in the end, they die and they are reduced to dust, this quintessence of dust. You can see the irony in that phrase, the quintessence of dust here. This is really a tragic view of the human story. This is the tragic plot line that Hamlet is now seeing that's unfolding before him. And it touches on this idea of the problem of nihilism. Um, Many realists, not many, but there are some realists who are what you would call nihilists, and that is nihilism. The problem of nihilism, the idea is that the universe is ultimately meaningless. Uh, and that because of this, human beings find themselves living in an absurd universe because it does lack meaning. And ultimately, for the nihilist, nothing therefore matters. Nothing matters in the universe because, uh, from the perspective of the universe, and remember, the universe for the realist is an unconscious and unintelligent unfolding process, and therefore it has zero IQ points, and therefore it, it doesn't seem to have any intention or design or aim. So the nihilist believes ultimately that nothing matters in the universe. And I would argue, or some realists believe this, I would argue that such realists are, again, they're not thinking uh, rationally, they're not being logical. Because I would agree, yes, that from the universe's perspective, there is no meaning in the universe. If we were no longer to exist, if human beings were to become extinct, if all the conscious sentient organisms on this planet were to suddenly become extinct, the universe, again, being unconscious and unintelligent, would certainly not suffer in any way. From the universe's perspective, uh, we simply, conscious sentient beings simply have no function. And so we would not be missed. I think I've often used the analogy, the idea that there are no uh, feeling beings on the planet Neptune. There are no Neptunians, if you will. And the universe doesn't seem to care, does it, that there aren't any conscious feeling organisms on that planet. And so it would be with our planet if we were to become extinct, if all the organisms on our planet were to become extinct. But I think some realists who call themselves nihilists, I do think they err in not realizing that though from the universe's perspective there is no meaning, from our perspective, from the perspective of the organisms on this planet who can feel, who can experience pain and suffering, that is meaningful. We have meaning because we do exist and we can be harmed, we can be hurt. And that gives our lives meaning. This idea of suffering uh, being of most value. And if you think, for example, of all the suffering that's occurring in the present, that certainly is meaningful from your own experiences. I would imagine you know how meaningful it is when you are in a state of dissatisfaction or discomfort, when you are suffering. Uh, and the future, think of all the future beings that are to come. Uh, and all the suffering that they will experience. Remember that as conscious sentient organisms with brains, our brain's primary function is to detect these problems, these states of unease and dissatisfaction, and to attempt to resolve uh, whatever problems these our brains are detecting. So whatever biological problems, whatever psychological needs we have, whatever cultural addictions we've developed, our brains are constantly uh, detecting these problems uh, and trying to, in some way, fix them, resolve them, so that so that our states of discomfort and dis-ease are alleviated. And so, again, the conscious sentient beings currently living and the ones that will be living in the future. And the future, remember, is so much greater than the present. And we also recall the past. I don't think anyone could seriously believe that all of the harm and all of the suffering and torture that sentient beings of the past experienced, that somehow that doesn't matter. That somehow, because they're dead now, it never happened, and that it's just ultimately of no importance, of no significance. So here Hamlet is when he says that man is ultimately this quintessence of dust. I would argue that he is to some extent touching on this idea of the problem of nihilism. Hamlet is confused. He sees existence on this planet as chaotic, as I said earlier, as unfair, as unjust, and man ultimately, despite all of his gifts and talents, his capacities to reason, that man ultimately is reduced to dust, and therefore there is a kind of irony in that idea for Hamlet, that ultimately it suggests that there is nothing that in the end matters in the universe. But once again, I would argue that Hamlet, though he is a philosopher, he's attempting to philosophize here, and he's trying to arrive at important truths based on the evidence, his observations, the evidence before him, that generally speaking, he's a poor philosopher. Occasionally, he does see his way. Occasionally, he does. At times, important truths are revealed to Hamlet, particularly in the to be or not to be soliloquy, as we will see in the next lecture. But for the most part, because he is a romantic, I think he is unable to discern uh, what is of value and what is of importance. And remember, too, the comic plot line that most people subscribe to, romantics, of course, subscribe to it, but some realists can subscribe to the comic plot line as well. But this idea that life itself is of most value for someone who imagines the human story unfolding along the comic plot line, and that life being of most value, that we should promote life and we should continue life. I think the realist, most realists would argue that life itself, in and of itself, is has no value. That life is not intrinsically valuable. It's really just an addiction that all feeling organisms have. The moment we come into the world is the moment that we find ourselves in these states of desire, of need, of want, of lack. And so all organisms, all feeling organisms, all organisms with brains, they continuously are attempting to satisfy their wants, satisfy their needs. And so very quickly they become addicted to trying to avoid harm, trying to escape pain and suffering, uh, not wanting to find themselves in these states of dis-ease. And so they become addicted uh, to life itself. I think the realist would say again that in and of itself, life has is not of any value. That's not to say that some lives don't have productive value. For Shakespeare, I would argue, I have argued that for Shakespeare, a productive life is a life that is a person who spends his or her life uh, attempting to reason and to be rational and discovering to live to be or attempting to be intellectually honest and discovering that through reason discovering that what's most important is preventing unnecessary harm. So some lives, yes, they do have productive value, but life in and of itself for most realists, I would say it has projected value. It doesn't have real value. It's the organism's need or want to continue to escape, to avoid harm and suffering. That the only thing of real value in the universe is ultimately, in the end, is ultimately suffering. It's ultimately pain. That has real value as opposed to projected value. Um, so here again, we see Hamlet, and he's philosophizing. He's become, we see his introspective nature here once more. And this is another, remember we discussed this is another uh, causal factor in his delay here. He becomes lost in thought and in reflecting about existence, about life and death here. But next, what happens next is rather interesting, and that is he's informed by Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. Hamlet is informed that a traveling troupe of players, of actors, have arrived at the palace at Elsinore, and we see Hamlet change here, doesn't he? He becomes extremely enthusiastic and excited, and he wants to meet the players. And we get again, this is a nice touch on the play's part, on Shakespeare's part, in showing us who Hamlet was before the action of this play began. The former Hamlet, the Hamlet who did have this idealistic view of the world and who was, you know, was able to find purpose and meaning in existence. And here we see how excited he is and wanting to greet the players and meet them. And we do meet them on page 1432 in your anthologies. And Hamlet wants to hear a speech performed by the first player when he meets them. And Hamlet's familiar with this speech. In fact, he knows the first few lines of the speech, which he begins to pronounce at line 440 or so here. And the speech he wants to hear performed by the actor concerns a particular episode in the Trojan War. And I put these terms on the board to help you understand a little bit about the background of the Trojan War so that you can understand why Hamlet is requesting that this speech be performed by the player. The Trojan War, if you recall, in Greek and Roman legends, the Trojan War was this great battle between the ancient Greek warriors and the ancient Trojan warriors. And the battle had been going on, had been underway for several decades. But the Greeks, who were renowned, they were famous for being the greatest of all warriors, of all military warriors. They were unable to defeat the Trojans because the city of Troy itself, the walls surrounding the city were impenetrable. They were impregnable because they had been constructed by some of the Greek gods. And so the walls were, I guess you would say they were magically constructed, if you will, and therefore no one would no enemy would ever be able to take the city because the walls were constructed by the Greeks, some of the Greek gods. So the Greeks, unable to uh, win the war, instead they come up with a scheme, a plan, and what they do is they pretend to simply concede that they can't defeat the Trojans, and uh, what they do is they construct a large wooden horse and leave it outside the gates of the city of Troy in honor, as a token of respect for the Trojans. And then the Greeks appear to set sail and to return to Greece. So the Trojans, when they see the Greeks sailing off, they rejoice and they open the gates to the city and they take the Trojan horse. It's this large wooden horse that the Greeks constructed, and they take that wooden horse and they uh, bring it into the city. They take it in, they bring it into the city, and then they celebrate their victory over the Greeks, and they party. They have a good time. They drink uh, and spend all evening rejoicing and enjoying themselves. And then they go to sleep. And as they're sleeping, what happens is the Greeks, what they had done was they had hollowed out the wooden horse, the space inside the horse, and inside that space they had concealed a number of Greek soldiers. And as soon as the Trojans passed out from having, drunk too much, and they're all asleep and vulnerable, the few soldiers hiding, concealed inside the wooden horse, they exit the horse and they open the gates to the city of Troy. And by this time, the Greek army has returned, and the Greeks simply enter the city and pillage and plunder and kill and destroy the city of Troy and defeat the Trojans. And one of those Greek soldiers who is concealed inside the horse is called Pyrrhus. And Pyrrhus is here on your board. He was a Greek warrior. And the other characters in this particular episode that you need to be familiar with are Priam and Hecuba. And Priam was the elderly king of Troy, and Hecuba was his queen. And Hamlet wants to hear this particular passage where Pyrrhus quietly exits from the horse and goes looking for King Priam. He wants to find King Priam and kill the king. And that's how this passage begins. And the question is, why does Hamlet want to hear this particular passage? So if you look at line 440 on page 1432 here, Hamlet begins reciting this particular episode from the speech. The rugged Pyrrhus, he whose sable arms, black as his purpose, did the knight resemble when he lay couched in the ominous horse. Notice how Pyrrhus is being depicted here as the villain of the piece here. It's he is in sable arms in a black suit of armor, and we know that black, of course, is the conventional symbol for evil. And his purpose is also black, and he resembles the night. So Pyrrhus is the figure here of evil. He's the villain in the piece. He symbolizes chaos and confusion, and he's couched in the ominous horse. So he's like a predator couched and ready to strike. And when he later in the same passage at the bottom of the page, line 452 or so, he's described as the hellish Pyrrhus who seeks out the grandsire Priam. That's he's seeking out the king here. And now the king, of course, Priam, is presented as the victim, as the innocent. If you look on page 1433 at the top of the page, Priam hunts down Priam and finds him. And at line 460, The first player who's taken up Hamlet's line says, "Unequal matched, Pyrrhus at Priam drives, in rage strikes wide, but with a whiff and wind of his fell sword, the unnerved father falls." So the idea that Pyrrhus finds Priam and he strikes at the old king, and Priam falls. The Pyrrhus misses Priam with the strike, but Priam nevertheless falls and finds himself on his knees and in a vulnerable position here at this point. And then next in the passage we hear, and notice again that Priam is being presented as the victim, as the innocent here. Then senseless Ilium, Ilium is the Greek term for the city of Troy, the poetic term for the city of Troy. Then senseless Ilium, seeming to feel this blow with flaming top, stoops to his base, and with a hideous crash takes prisoner Pyrrhus's ear. So at this very moment, when Pyrrhus strikes at Priam and misses Priam, and Priam falls to the ground, the city itself, uh, uh, the first player here, the city itself is personified. The city appears to feel the strike, and at that instant comes crashing down. Remember, the city is in flames. The Greeks have entered the city, and they're now in the process of killing everyone within the city. And the city itself is on fire, and the walls of the city come crashing down at this point, a hideous crash. And it's this noise that causes Pyrrhus to pause. He raises his sword above Priam and is ready to bring the sword down and hack the good, innocent king to death. And at that very moment, as his sword is raised above his head, we hear, "For lo, his sword, which was declining on the milky head of Reverend Priam, seemed in the air to stick." And here we look at that description again, the milky head of Reverend Priam. The milky head here, milk, of course, a conventional symbol here, suggesting innocence, purity, reminding us of the color white. And Priam is mentioned here. He's described as reverend, as good. And Pyrrhus at this moment hears that noise. Why does he pause? Why does Pyrrhus pause at this moment, just as he's ready to bring the sword down and slaughter the good old king? It's because he's distracted. He hears the sounds at that very moment. The walls of the city come tumbling down, come crashing down. And it's that noise, that sound, that hideous crash that distracts Pyrrhus temporarily from killing the king. But Pyrrhus is a classical warrior, he's an ancient Greek warrior. And therefore, he's not going to hesitate. He's only temporarily distracted by this external noise, this sound. He doesn't have inner conflicts like Hamlet has. He's not, Hamlet, remember, is not your stereotypical avenger. He's not the ancient Greek or ancient Roman avenger. So the only reason that Pyrrhus pauses, in contrast to Hamlet's delay, the only reason that Pyrrhus delays is because of the noise, is because of that very moment the walls come crashing down. But the moment that the walls have fallen, Pyrrhus proceeds. If you look at line 476, "So after Pyrrhus's pause, aroused vengeance sets him new a work, and never did the Cyclops' hammers fall on Mars's armor, forged for proof etern, with less remorse than Pyrrhus's bleeding sword now falls on Priam." So Pyrrhus pauses, his sword raised high above his head. The great warrior pauses, only temporarily because he is momentarily distracted, and then down comes his sword, and he viciously, brutally kills, hacks the old king in pieces to death. And while this is going on, The queen of Troy, Priam's wife, Hecuba, is witnessing all. She's witnessing her husband being slaughtered, being horrifically killed. And she becomes so, the scene is one of such horror, and she becomes so fearful and so distracted by what she's seeing that she runs mad. She up and down all through the streets of Troy. She runs and mad and in great alarm and horror at what she's seeing here. And that's this episode here. This is what Hamlet is wanting to hear. And the question is, why does he want to hear this particular episode? And several critics have noted that Hamlet, again, I would argue that this is Hamlet's way of revenging himself on those who have harmed him, who've hurt him because of their callous behavior, their indifference to the death of the elder King Hamlet. Um, and particularly Gertrude and Claudius, of course. Ironically, Claudius and Gertrude are not present to hear the speech, but Hamlet is, he does have this need, this psychological need to attack, to accuse those around him for their indifference, for their pretense. Uh, he wishes to accuse them of having been insincere and not genuinely caring for the former great and good king. And it's also a way for Hamlet to justify his own emotions, his own feelings. It's a way for him to uh, rationalize, to justify that what he has been feeling, the grief that he's been experiencing, and the pain he's been suffering because of his father's death and because of the way others have reacted to that death. That it's a way for him to justify his grief and to justify his sorrow, and he needs to do this. And also, he wants to stir himself, he wants to rouse himself again to act. And this passage from the speech has the ability, as we shall see in his next soliloquy, it succeeds in rousing Hamlet, in stirring him to act. Because remember, 2 months have passed since the first and the second act of the play, and Hamlet has failed to fulfill the ghost's commandment. He's failed to follow through on the ghost's injunction. So, what Hamlet is doing here is he's imagining this scene unfolding, and he's imagining that Pyrrhus, the villain of the piece, is representing his uncle, is representing Claudius. Claudius is the villain of this particular piece in Hamlet's mind. This is what he is imagining, what he is seeing. And Priam is representing Hamlet's father, the elder King Hamlet. And of course, Hecuba is representing Gertrude. Uh, Hamlet, Hamlet imagines that Hamlet believes Gertrude should have behaved the way that Hecuba behaves in this passage, but that she fails to do so, that she fails to understand, to comprehend the horror, of the moment here in this passage. That she's completely, that she's been a woman she's been unfaithful. She's been an adulterer. She uh, has so quickly forgotten his father and therefore desecrated his Hamlet's father's memory. And so this is how Hamlet imagines Gertrude should have acted. She should have behaved like Hecuba, but she failed to do so. So this is what Hamlet see here. What several critics have seen here is what Hamlet is imagining unfolding here. Each of these characters in this drama, in this speech here, are representing in Hamlet's mind uh, uh, these very real players in Hamlet's life. But there's another story here that is unfolding. Another way that these characters can be represented. And one critic has noted the second way that that this story is being used, but that Hamlet is not aware of the second way of interpreting the story, the second way of seeing what's going on here. The second way, again, Hamlet's not aware of this. It's another one of the inner conflicts that he's unaware of. But this second way that the story can be imagined, can be represented, is that in this case, uh, Pyrrhus is assuming the role of Hamlet. And to understand this, and that Priam represents Claudius and Hecuba still representing Gertrude, but in a different sense. And the way to understand this, it's going to seem a bit complicated, but it's not too terribly difficult to grasp here. I've just sort of giving you the essentials here. If you want to find out more about the Trojan War and these characters and their involvement in the war and the roles they played and so forth, you can simply look online. But Hector and Paris are Trojan warriors, and they are the sons of King Priam. And Hector is killed in battle during the war. He's killed by the greatest of all the Greek warriors, Achilles. Perhaps you've heard of Achilles' heel, that phrase, Achilles' heel. So Hector is killed by Achilles in battle. And Paris, Hector's brother, in revenge for Hector's death, hunts down Achilles and kills Achilles in revenge. And then in turn, Pyrrhus, who is the son of Achilles, seeks out Paris. Oh no, I'm sorry. Seeks out Priam himself. Pyrrhus goes to the root, to the source, to the father of these sons. So Pyrrhus hunts down Priam and slaughters the king in revenge for his father Achilles' death, for his killing. So in the second interpretation, Hamlet is actually Pyrrhus. Hamlet, Pyrrhus is representing Hamlet because Hamlet is the avenger who is seeking out Claudius. Claudius is here being presented as the villain. Pyrrhus is the avenger, avenging his father's death. Hamlet is avenging his father's death, seeking out the villain. Claudius, remember, Priam is representing Claudius, and Priam is the source of Hector, and he's the father and Hector of Hector and Paris. So Priam is the source of evil here. Now, this second interpretation, Hamlet, this particular critic argues, is not aware of the second interpretation, but it does underscore a conflict. Again, operating at the subconscious level, another causal factor for Hamlet's delay. And this time, that conflict is a clash between cultural codes, the cultural code of Christianity and the cultural code of military honor. And I touched briefly on the cultural code of military honor. So let me discuss that in a bit more detail here. So again, it's asking the question, what makes a man? And according to the cultural code, and remember, a cultural code is a set of beliefs that a particular culture, a particular group of people subscribe to, and people are raised to believe, to subscribe to this set of beliefs. So the cultural code of military honor, it has its origins in paganism, in ancient and Greek legend, or times rather. And the idea is what is it that makes a man? Ultimately, the highest virtue is that a man can possess is the virtue of courage. It's the idea that the military man is the man who confronts death on the battlefield. It's the man who exhibits his courage, his bravery, who challenges death, who exhibits his military prowess, his strength, his fortitude on the battlefield in confronting death. And the military man, therefore, is the man to be honored. It's a kind of secular immortality project, correct? Because the military man believes that he can establish a reputation, a name for himself. He can become famous. He can be glorified by his military bravery, his by his military skills on the battlefield in confronting death. And so he can establish a reputation, make a name for himself, become renowned, become famous for his great military exploits, his great feats upon the battlefield. And now, if the military man's honor is in any way threatened, if his reputation is in any way challenged, then the course of action for the man of manly and martial honor, the course of action is revenge. Revenge is seen as a positive act, as a means of restoring one's name, of restoring the family name, the family honor. So revenge is actually viewed as an ennobling act. It's a way of restoring pride. It's a pride restoring behavior. And this conflicts, of course, with the cultural code of Christianity. And remember, Hamlet's been raised in both uh, 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 in a culture that subscribes to both of these codes. And we can see a contradiction here, a conflict between these two codes, because the cultural code of Christianity, remember the chief idea, what makes a man is that what is a man's chief virtue? It's his goodness. The Christian is a man who strives to be good, who strives to love the enemy, who is to forgive those who trespass against him, who longs to be humble and meek. The Christian is not a man who becomes aggressive, who is violent. No, he shuns violence. He abhors aggression. He has no interest in establishing a name or a reputation in this world. He simply wants to be the best, the best Christian he can be, so that ultimately he will be rewarded in the world to come, in the Christian paradise, the Christian heaven. And so you can see this idea, you can see this conflict between these two cultural codes. And then we recall that the ghost, when he appears to the soldiers and to Horatio and then to Hamlet, that the ghost comes dressed, he's fully armored. He comes in a suit of armors. And we also recall that the elder King Hamlet was challenged to hand combat by the King of Norway, and that the elder King Hamlet exhibited his courage and his strength by accepting the challenge and by defeating the King of Norway in battle. And so he established this reputation for himself as this great military war hero. And so we can see here that this conflict is yet another causal factor, I would argue, that's operating once again at the subconscious level. Hamlet is not aware, if you recall, Hamlet is not aware of most of these conflicts. They're happening at the subconscious level. These are inner conflicts of which he's not cognizant of them. He's not aware of them. And this would be one of them. Here we have the ghost. If you recall the scene, the meeting between the ghost and Hamlet. Here we have the ghost dressed in his military suit of armor, and with a reputation as being, this military hero. And he's calling upon Hamlet to be aggressive, to be the man of aggression, to be the man who seeks revenge for his father's death, for his father's murder. Remember, the ghost claims that the elder King Hamlet, Hamlet's father, was murdered by Hamlet's uncle, by Claudius. And so this idea of seeking revenge, avenging the family name, avenging the family reputation, reestablishing pride, restoring pride to the name of Hamlet. This is what the ghost is calling upon Hamlet to do, the prince to do. So we can see that conflict operating uh, um, again at the subconscious level. I was thinking some of you might be interested for topic B. You might be interested in just exploring the meeting between Hamlet and the ghost, looking at that scene in depth, because within that message, within the ghost message, we touched on a number of contradictions, a number of conflicts. Uh, some of which Hamlet is aware, remember, that this uncertainty surrounding the ghost's status. Although by the end of the meeting, Hamlet believes that the ghost is honest. Remember, he tells both Horatio and Marcellus that it is an honest ghost, that the ghost has told the truth. He doesn't reveal to Horatio or Marcellus what the ghost has said, but Hamlet believes at that moment, at that particular moment, Hamlet believes that the ghost has been honest with Hamlet, that the ghost is telling the truth, that Claudius did murder Hamlet's father, the elder King Hamlet, and that Gertrude was an adulterer, that she was unfaithful to Hamlet's father. So Hamlet is aware of this conflict at times. He recognizes, he realizes that he doesn't know for certain who this ghost is or what this ghost's is, what the ghost's intentions are. Is it a spirit of health or a goblin damned? But there are other within the message itself, within the ghost message itself, the communication itself to Hamlet. There are these other conflicts that are occurring inside within Hamlet, right? At the subconscious level. We discussed, for example, the contradiction in Hamlet being called upon to murder, and yet in the same breath, the ghost says that murder is most foul, as in the best it is, for whatever justification, for whatever rationale, that murder is wrong, that one should not commit murder, and yet the ghost is asking Hamlet to revenge his foul and most unnatural murder. So we've seen that contradiction. We've also seen the contradiction within the cultural code of Christianity itself. The idea that on the one hand, Hamlet should honor his father. We remember the fifth commandment, honor thy father and thy mother. So Hamlet should obey the ghost. If the ghost is the ghost of Hamlet's father, Hamlet should respect his father's wishes. He should honor him. He should do as the ghost says. On the other hand, we recall that the ghost is asking Hamlet to kill, and we called the sixth commandment in the Christian canon. For Protestants, at least, it's the sixth commandment, the commandment that thou shalt not kill. So we see a contradiction within the code itself. We also recall the conflict that's raised in Hamlet's mind. The ghost keeps reminding Hamlet of the incestuous nature of the relationship between Claudius and Gertrude, and yet the ghost also tells Hamlet he orders Hamlet to leave Gertrude to heaven for her conscience, right, to sting her. Uh, Leave her. Don't in any way harm his mother. Respect her. Honor his mother, and respect her, and don't in any way become aggressive towards her or abuse her in any way, either verbally or physically. So we see that conflict operating as well. And then this conflict I've just raised here, this idea of this clash between these two cultural codes, the code of military honor and the code of Christianity. So I think that you could write an essay. I think there's plenty of material there, plenty of evidence in that one particular scene in the meeting, the conference between Hamlet and the ghost. You could look specifically at Act One, Scene 4, and Act One, Scene 5, and those two scenes together, I think, would be an excellent topic idea for option B. And so at the end here, at the end of this speech by the first player, again, Hamlet has longed to hear this speech. It's a way, I would argue, remember another one of Hamlet's, another one of the causal, the deterministic causes behind his delay is this need to revenge himself. And here he's let it through by hearing this speech, again, indirectly, he's lashing out, he's attacking, he's accusing those who have hurt him, who have caused him such pain, and who have forgotten his father. In forgetting his father, they have caused Hamlet such grief. And also, it does, in Hamlet's mind, it does justify that the way he is feeling is the correct way to feel. That it's the others who are not behaving. That Hamlet's response to his father's loss, to his father's death, uh, his deep sorrow, his deep grief, his melancholy, his brooding about it, his sinking into depression, that this is the natural response. It's heartfelt, it's genuine, and that the others, and they're not feeling the way Hamlet does, that the others are somehow lacking. They somehow all was pretense, it was all a sham. They're caring for their devotion to, and they're caring for uh, the elder King Hamlet. And we see how moved Hamlet is after he hears this speech by the first player. So let's turn to page 1434. And at the bottom of the page, we have Hamlet's third soliloquy, beginning at line 536. Hamlet is alone on stage. The players have exited, and Rosencrantz and Guildenstern as well. They've left the stage. Polonius has left the stage, and Hamlet is all alone, and he speaks in his third soliloquy. And this is an interesting soliloquy, isn't it? Hamlet here we see is really disgusted with himself. Here we have a series of self denunciations, if you will. It just is this enormous release of self hate and self loathing. And Hamlet calls himself several names. You know, he's really attacking himself. He can't understand why he hasn't acted. Here he's just seen this first player, this actor, the first player, become so moved, so emotional, tears in the actor's eyes, and and he's become his voice has become his voice quivers and shakes with emotion, and Hamlet recalls that the actor is just speaking, is just making a speech. He's performing, and it's all a fiction. That Hecuba is just a fiction, and yet the player can become so moved in speaking these lines from this particular passage in the speech. And the player, the actor becomes so moved, and yet Hamlet, what has he moved forward? Has he acted on the ghost's injunction, the ghost's commandment to revenge his foul and most unnatural murder? No, Hamlet hasn't done a thing. Hamlet seems to not be feeling, to not be, he seems to be uncaring, unfeeling, to not be a good son because he hasn't acted on the ghost commandment, the ghost order. And so Hamlet berates himself. Look what he says here at the bottom of page 134. Again, I'm in Act 2, Scene 2, line 536. Oh, what a rogue and peasant slave am I! Hamlet is a rogue. He's a worthless criminal, good for nothing. He's a peasant slave, the lowest order of human beings, a peasant and a slave. And look what he says on the next page, page 1435 at line 554. Hamlet sees himself. He hasn't acted. He's tried to escape his duty, and he's been behaving like a dull and muddy-metaled rascal. That he's peaked like John of Dreams. He's become dull and lethargic and stupid and if you will, he's been in a kind of stupor. He's been distracted from his mission, and he hasn't acted, and he just can't understand why. Why hasn't he followed through on the ghost directive? Why hasn't he moved forward? And he asks himself, he says, am I a coward? One of the film adaptations of the play, the one with David Tennant, and some of you may be familiar with Tennant. I myself don't watch the series Doctor Who, but some of my students from the past informed me that David Tennant is one of the doctors on Doctor Who, and David Tennant plays Hamlet in one of the film adaptations. And at this moment in the movie, Tennant as Hamlet, playing Hamlet, he turns and addresses the gambler. He breaks that fourth wall of illusion, and that we're being asked to suspend our disbelief. He breaks that wall of illusion and he speaks directly into the camera. He addresses the audience directly and he says, am I a coward? And I think the director has the actor do this because I think Hamlet at this moment wants to know, is he a coward? Is that the reason why he hasn't followed through? Is why he hasn't acted? Why he's been so lackadaisical? Why he's been so dull and muddy-mettled? And he wants to know. He sincerely, genuinely wants to know. So will somebody tell him, please? He can't understand. It's not a rhetorical question, in other words. Hamlet sees himself as having behaved cowardly. He must have been a coward. Am I a coward? Yes, yes, it must be that he's been a coward. He wants to know and he answers his own question, yes. And he says, whoever were to call him a coward, they would be correct in their assessment that that's what he absolutely must be. He must be a coward. He says at line 562, whoever calls him a coward, who does me this? Ha! Swoons, I should take it. For it cannot be but I am pigeon-livered and lack gall to make oppression bitter. He says, yes, I am a coward. Otherwise, how could I have not proceeded? How could I have not, by this time, after 2 months, how could I have not taken revenge? How could I have not sought Claudius out and revenged my father's murder? Here, of course, Hamlet believing the ghost once again, believing the ghost is speaking the truth. Yes, he must be a coward. That's what it is. And Hamlet really works himself up here. He becomes highly agitated, highly excited, extremely emotional. Look what happens to him here. He loses all control, doesn't he? I should take it, for it cannot be but I am pigeon-livered and lack gall to make oppression bitter. Or ere this I should have fatted all the region kites with this slave's offal. He imagines what a really dark and ominous image here. horrific image. He imagines, right, taking his sword and slicing Claudius open and reaching in and grabbing, ripping out Claudius's entrails and holding his guts up to the heavens, holding them high above his head and allowing the predatory birds, the vultures, the kites to swoop down, allowing them to swoop down and eat the innards of Claudius. What a really, you can see here, this man, his psychological desire at this moment, his need to kill Claudius, to revenge, to seek revenge. It's really reached this horrific uh, pitch, this moment here. He's completely lost all control. His emotions are carrying him away, and he cries out, "Bloody, baldy villain! Remorseless, treacherous, lecherous, kindless villain! Oh, vengeance!" This is a man who is being overcome, overwhelmed, swept away by his emotional needs, by his psychological desire here. And then what happens? My favorite line in the play. Personally, this is my favorite line. Why, what an ass am I? And we recall Bottom from A Midsummer Night's Dream, the metaphor here of being an ass. Why, what an ass am I? Just, Hamlet suddenly realizes, right, at this moment, this moment where he's called upon uh, the region's kites to feed upon Claudius's offal, the slaves' offal, the innards, the entrails of Claudius here. He realizes that he has lost control, that he's not being rational. He's not thinking clearly. And once again, I think it's Shakespeare's way, and again, I mean the play's way of underscoring this idea that we human beings, we have this capacity to reason. We have, remember Hamlet himself's an apprehension, how like a god. We have the power to act on our knowledge the knowledge we discover through reasoning, in action, how like an angel. And we have, and what we discover, these most important truths, we can use our abilities, our rational faculties. We can use our brains to act in a way that is ethically decent. And here Hamlet realizes that the beast within has taken over. And remember, I've argued before that our intelligence should be the ruler. Our intelligence should rule the animal within each of us, the desires within each of us. Uh, well, I guess depending on those desires, I'm thinking of my last lecture when I myself became really impassioned and really excited discussing, contrasting projected versus real value. Yeah, I think we are human. I made the argument that there were robots, we're feeling robots, but we are human. And we do have desires and we do have passions and needs and wants. But if we can channel those passions, those emotions properly, uh, if we can understand what's of most value, what's most important, uh, this prevention and this reduction of harm, unnecessary harm in the world, that all conscious feeling organisms, the harm they experience, we need to do our best and not to cause unnecessary harm to other humans and I would argue other uh, uh, species, right? That yeah, that's something to become passionate about. Racism, sexism, homophobia, speciesism, these ideas, this we should become passionate that we should direct our passions and our emotions in this direction. But here, Hamlet, the desire for revenge and for killing. Here he says, hold up, wait a minute, what an ass am I? And he reins back the beast. He puts the leash back on the animal. And what happens next? Something really interesting in the play happens here at the bottom of page 1435. Hamlet says at line 575, about my brains, about my brains. Brains here, of course, symbolizing the rational Hamlet, the man of reason. The man, remember, Hamlet longs. I make the argument that Hamlet really does wish to be a man of integrity. He uses the word nobility, noble, but that word is sort of today it has a negative connotation that suggests someone of a particular class and a privileged class. But for us, the word I would argue is integrity. Hamlet wants to be, more than anything, I think he wants to be a man of integrity. And by that, again, I mean a man who is rational, who acts according to uh, uh, the knowledge that he has gained, that he has observed, and the truths that present themselves from that or can be rationally deduced from that knowledge. This is what he wants to be. He wants to be a rational man. He wants to be an ethical man. I think. I used the metaphor earlier to be as little a jackass as he can be, or to be as the best functioning robot that he can be. Uh, Someone who is productive, someone who can make a difference in the world. I think this idea of nobility, of integrity, this matters to Hamlet. This matters most to him. And this idea of knowledge, with knowledge comes power. The because with knowledge comes power and a new understanding, a more accurate way of understanding reality. And so, with that knowledge comes responsibility. With that knowledge also comes limitations, and that's important to understand. The more knowledgeable we become, intelligence. Uh, you know, uh, Intelligence uh, can lead to compassion. It can lead to caring about others, but it doesn't have to. One doesn't have to care. Uh, but I don't think Shakespeare is asking anyone in this audience to care for other human beings or other sentient organisms. But with intelligence comes the knowledge, the rational knowledge that others can be harmed. And so with knowledge comes this limitation on how we have to act. The more civilized a society becomes, the more limitations that society must impose upon itself, because it does realize each individual that makes up that society realizes that ultimately what matters is preventing unnecessary harm, not personal happiness or personal gain, but rather, this idea of being the superhero, being the one who gets in the battle, who fights for the cause, who realizes that uh, with knowledge comes this responsibility, and that these limitations also come with intelligence. But as I said, intelligence doesn't have to lead to compassion. It does in some people, but others it doesn't. But it isn't really necessary. It isn't required that one care, that one feel for others. It's just the idea that one has to understand that others can be harmed and can feel, that their brains aren't doing anything differently than your brain or my brain. that they too can be their brains can also be in these states of dissatisfaction. They are living these value-rich lives, um, and that they can be harmed. And that's what's most important, is coming to that rational understanding, because that will lead to ethical behavior. In the person of intelligence, that leads to unethical uh, uh, lifestyle. A code of principles, right, is developed from, is derived from that ability to reason, and that ultimately leads to, uh, teaches one, or uh, as one discovers how best to engage with the world. So yeah, compassion isn't necessary, and I don't think you have to necessarily imagine yourself, you know, as one of these other conscious sentient organisms being harmed. I don't think you have to experience that either. Some people can move beyond compassion and can actually imagine themselves as being the ones being harmed. But I don't even think that's necessary. But at any rate, Hamlet does call upon his brains. Here he is, wishing to be the man of reason, the man who applies his rational capacities. And what does he say here about my brains? And suddenly he recalls from his experiences, he appreciates acting, he enjoys plays, and he says, I have heard, again, I'm at line 575, I have heard that guilty creatures sitting at a play have, by the very cunning of the scene, been struck so to the soul that presently they have proclaimed their malefactions. It's interesting that people sitting watching a play, that the unfolding action at times in the play has somehow touched people, and they've suddenly recognized that what's occurring on the stage, that in some way parallels what has occurred to them in their own lives, their own situations, their own experiences, and suddenly, right, they realize, they recognize that they have caused harm, that they have done wrong by watching the action on the stage unfold. It's the idea that art can enlighten, that art can raise people's consciousness. Obviously, Shakespeare subscribes to this idea that art is a way for us, the way that truths can be revealed to people. Art can reveal, can present these truths to people, and they can discover them. They can see them. Their consciousnesses can be raised, and they can be enlightened uh, uh, by art, through art. Art can be, if you will, a kind of instrument of revelation. And that's what Hamlet discovers here. Because from his past experiences and watching plays and watching people watching plays, he's discovered that the art can have this kind of effect on others. And so he decides that what he'll do here, he's got a plan begins to form, right, in his brain. Look what he says at the top of page 1436. I'll have these players play something like the murder of my father before mine uncle. So he's going to have the players put on a play, have them perform uh, 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 something similar to what the ghost has claimed. Remember, the ghost claimed that Hamlet's father, the elder King Hamlet, was poisoned while he was sleeping in his garden, that Claudius, the elder King Hamlet's brother, Claudius, murdered him while he was sleeping, while the king was sleeping. And Hamlet's going to have this presented before the king, before Claudius, before Gertrude, before the entire court. I'll have these players play something like the murder of my father before mine uncle. I'll observe his looks, his uncle's looks. I'll tint him to the quick. He's going to very carefully keep an eye on Claudius while Claudius is watching the play. Hamlet will be watching Claudius. Hamlet wants to see if Claudius reacts in any way to this scene that Hamlet will have presented before his uncle, the scene of a king being murdered by a brother in a garden while the king is sleeping. This is what Hamlet's going to have. This is the kind of play, this is the scene from a play that Hamlet will have performed before his uncle. And then he's going to watch his uncle. If he do blench, I know my course. If Claudius in any way reveals that he recognizes himself in the role of the villain, the murderer in the play, if Claudius reacts, if he somehow reveals his guilt, then Hamlet will know what course to take. Notice Hamlet doesn't say, by the way, he doesn't say what his course, he doesn't tell us what his course will be. He just says, I know my course. We can assume that he then will seek revenge, but we wonder what exactly will be his course at that point. But here, in this moment, Hamlet is a man of action. He's got a plan. He's the man with the plan here, and he has a plan. He has a newfound purpose. He's going to become a man of action here. Look what he says next. Oh, but before I move to this, what he says next, I need to point out that here is yet another causal feature, another determining factor behind Hamlet's delay. Is rather than simply seeking out Claudius like Paris seeks out Priam and avenges his father's death, his father Achilles, his father's killing by revenging himself on Priam, the father of the son who killed Pyrrhus's father Achilles, by killing. Remember, Hector is killed by Achilles, and Paris then kills Achilles. So here, rather than Hamlet simply seeking out Claudius, like that stereotypical Roman or Greek avenger, instead, he's going to use his ability to reason. He's going to put on a play. He's going to use art to enlighten, to touch Claudius, to get Claudius in some way to reveal his guilt. Who knows? Perhaps Claudius will actually confess confess his crime. I mean, after all, what other evidence could come forward? Claudius recalled, if Claudius is a killer, if Claudius did murder his brother, the elder King Hamlet, then he committed the perfect crime. So the only way to know for certain, because the ghost, we don't know if we can trust the ghost. Hamlet doesn't know if the ghost is trustworthy. So the only way to know for absolute certainty is if Claudius confesses his crime. So perhaps Claudius will even confess his crime. If he does see himself, it's the idea that Hamlet is going to hold the mirror up to nature. He wants Claudius to look in that mirror and see himself, see what he has done. On the stage, Hamlet wants his uncle to see the murder enacted on stage, so Claudius will see himself as the murderer and see the horror, the horrific crime that he committed. And perhaps he might even, at that moment, feel such deep guilt and remorse over his crime that he might publicly confess. He might come forward and confess. It is possible. It is a possibility. And then look what Hamlet says at line 5. But anyway, there is another cause that you could explore. Hamlet does delay in hunting down and killing Claudius, in seeking vengeance, because instead, what does Hamlet do? He decides to take a rational, to make a rational plan of attack, and to use his ability to reason, to use art, to use reason and art in order to discover for certain if Claudius is a killer, if Claudius is a murderer. And then look what Hamlet says at the close of the soliloquy. Fascinating what he says next. The spirit that I have seen may be a devil. He's referring to the ghost, of course. And here, look what Hamlet says. The spirit I have seen may be a devil. And we recall Hamlet's first words to the ghost: Be thou a spirit of health or goblin damned. Bring the airs from heaven or blast from hell. Be thy intents wicked or charitable. This problem of knowing the other mind. And in this case, the interesting uh, uh, problem Shakespeare is raising is the inability to know the other mind when it is a supernatural mind in particular. How can Hamlet know for certain? We don't have access. None of us has access. If the supernatural world were to exist, if there were such things as supernatural beings, how could any human being have access into that supernatural being's brain, into that supernatural being's mind? How could we know for certain what that being was thinking or feeling, what that being's intentions were, purpose, what that being's purpose was, that being's aim was? And here, the spirit that I have seen may be a devil, and notice, and now it becomes the devil. Remember, as a Christian prince, Hamlet believes in devils, and he believes in the devil, the Christian devil, right? He believes, from the stories in the Bible that he's read, he believes in the devil. And notice how a devil becomes the devil, because the spirit that Hamlet has seen, who knows, it may be the devil from Christian legend, from Christian stories itself, that's come before Hamlet to tempt Hamlet's soul. Remember, again, as a romantic, Hamlet believes he has a soul, a non-physical something or other, a non-physical entity, separate from the physical body. That soul can be eternally damned for all eternity. It can be tortured and tormented in the Christian hell. And so Hamlet has these concerns about his soul, whether or not this ghost is the devil or not, and whether this ghost has come to tempt him, and tempt his soul to eternal damnation. The spirit that I have seen may be a devil, and the devil. Notice again the switch from a. Notice the indefinite article a devil to the definite article the devil. Is it a devil? Is it the devil? Perhaps may be a devil, and the devil hath power to assume a pleasing shape. Remember, the devil is imbued with all of these particular powers. And one is that he can change his shape. He can come in the form of a serpent. If you recall the story of the Garden of Eden from the Christian religious text, a text that is sacred to Christians, and the devil comes in the form of a snake, a talking serpent. And here the devil perhaps has come in the shape of Hamlet's father. A pleasing shape. It would be pleasing in Hamlet's eyes, wouldn't it? If the devil were to come in that particular shape. Look, and that if he appeared as Hamlet's father. Yea, and perhaps out of my weakness and my melancholy. And what is Hamlet's weakness? The devil would know this too, of course, wouldn't he? What is Hamlet's weakness? Well, Hamlet idealizes his father. Remember, he compares his father to Hyperion, the great Greek Titan god. And this is Hamlet's weakness, this idealization of his father, this reverence he holds for his father, seeing his father as a kind of god, one who can do no wrong, as the source of light and truth and reason. Hamlet is a sort of one-man cult, isn't he? He's idolized and revered his father, and with the loss of his father's death, and with the desecration of his father's memory, Hamlet's own immortality project, right? We've seen it come crashing down. It's wiped out. It goes up in flames like those walls of Ilium, like the city of Troy. It flames up and crashes, and a hideous crash comes down. the idea that one can be forgotten. And here, this is Hamlet's particular weakness. Also, you could argue another one of Hamlet's weaknesses is his hatred for his uncle. Hamlet wants to believe that his uncle is guilty. He has a bias. He's prejudiced. Just as I said earlier, when we were talking about nihilism, we human beings, we're biased, we're prejudiced. We think, right, that we are the paragon of animals, the beauty of the world. That's our particular bias. And we think some human beings, right, the romantics in particular, think that human beings are indispensable to the functioning of the universe. Without us, that the universe somehow, that the universe somehow needs us. So Hamlet, because of his bias, because of his prejudice, he wants to believe that Claudius is guilty. He wants to believe that his mother is an adulterer, that she's misbehaved, that she's been unfaithful to his father at this point. Would justify, right? It would explain why she behaved the way she did after the loss of her husband, why she seemed so callous and so uh, 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 shallow, superficial. Out of my weakness and my melancholy. And again, Hamlet's melancholy, specifically, the one he's aware of course, is his deep grief over the loss of his father. He's not aware of the loss over his immortality project. He's not aware of these other conflicts occurring, causing him to brood and, you know, he's aware of some of these conflicts. He's aware of his disillusionment with the world and with humanity. Yes, this he understands. He understands he's grieving over the loss of his father. But many of the conflicts are internal, and he's not aware of them. He's trying to understand. But this would be his melancholy. Yea, and perhaps out of my weakness and my melancholy, as he is very potent with such spirits. Hamlet has a full set of beliefs when it comes to demonic possession and temptation, doesn't he? He abuses me to damn me. The ghost, perhaps the devil himself, is abusing Hamlet to damn Hamlet's soul for all eternity. And then he says, and look, he puns here yet again, I'll have grounds more relative than this. Remember, the ghost is claiming to be Hamlet's father, a relative of Hamlet. I'll have grounds more relative than this. All right, he wants proof. It can't simply be hearsay. You don't walk into a court of law and convict someone on hearsay. You need proof. And particularly when it comes to the hearsay of a supernatural being. You need grounds more relative than this. Hamlet thinking like a lawyer here. He's being rational, isn't he? Thinking like a good lawyer, like a true realist here. So he's having a moment where he is being rational, he is thinking sensibly here. I'll have grounds more relative than this. The play's the thing wherein I'll catch the conscience of the king. Notice what he wants to do here. Again, he wants to use art. The play is the thing. Hold that mirror. Art is that mirror. Hold it up to nature. That's what good art does, right? The good artist gives us an accurate understanding of reality. Because we don't live in reality, we live in the model of reality, the model here inside our brains. And we need as accurate a description of that real world as we can get if we are going to function properly in the world, if we are going to become civilized. We need to understand what that reality is. We need to get as close to reality as we can. That's all important, to hold that mirror up to nature. That's what the good artist does. That's why I made the argument that here, this play is not in any way I'm making the argument. It's not in any way supporting that a supernatural realm exists. That the ghost is appearing in the play as a thought experiment. It's showing the problems with people, the problems with belief in the supernatural realm. Because many people, many romantics believe in the supernatural world and they believe they have access to it, that they can understand it, they can know what a god or gods or ghost or what they're thinking. And they act on their beliefs, and that can be quite dangerous. It can cause a lot of unnecessary harm, particularly when it becomes organized, and that's what's going on here. I think Shakespeare would have a problem with the agnostic too. Remember, agnosticism is the idea that when it comes to the supernatural, in this case, when it comes to the supernatural world, we can't really know one way or the other whether such a world exists or whether beings populate a supernatural realm like gods, if they exist. And the realist would say, no, of course we can know beyond a rational doubt. There's no evidence to suggest, the realist says, there's zero evidence to suggest that such a realm exists. And we've gone through all the problems with such a belief. And all the evidence we have suggests just the opposite, that such a realm does not exist. I think Shakespeare would have a problem with the agnostic. He would see the agnostic as insulting human beings' intelligence. All the work, all the energy and time spent by the people who come before us and by the people today and the people of the future, all their investigations, their scientific explorations, all the the data they've accumulated, the facts, those those scientific truths are not going to suddenly uh, uh, become untrue. Scientific truths aren't suddenly going to be found to be false. We know beyond a rational doubt that the Earth rotates on its axis and revolves around the sun. We know beyond a rational doubt that where we come from, right? Of all the scientific theories, evolution is the strongest in any scientific theory out there. The evidence, it's a Mount Everest mountain of evidence to support the theory of evolution, where we come from, where we originate. We make these scientific, we know that when people become mentally ill, mentally disabled, that it isn't demonic possession, that it isn't right. It is a problem with brains. We can trace back the problems. Uh, we have the scientific data before us, the proof, and beyond a rational doubt, with meaning that any rational person, any intelligent person, is not going to suddenly say, "Well, you don't know. It's possible that Bugs Bunny exists and created the universe, and that he's currently living in a condominium in Florida with Tinkerbell." No, there's no evidence to support that particular belief. And all the evidence on the contrary, uh, it shows that particular belief can't possibly be true. We know Bugs Bunny is a fiction, Tinkerbell is a fiction. We know human beings have a tendency to tell stories. They have an imagination. They try to explain things they can't understand by imagining things that aren't real. But here, Hamlet is the man of reason, the plays the thing, art, the good artist. Hamlet is becoming a good artist here, a good philosopher, a good scientist. The plays the thing. He wants proof positive. The plays proof beyond a rational doubt. The plays the thing wherein I'll catch the conscience of the king. And notice too, and most importantly, where his reasoning is leading him. He wants to catch the conscience of the king. He's not saying here he wants the life of the king, that he knows his course, he will seek out revenge if he discovers Claudius is guilty. That's not what this man at this moment, this man of reasoning is saying. He wants to catch the conscience of the king, to get Claudius to confess, to get Claudius to understand, to comprehend that what he did was bad. What he did was unethical. To catch his conscience. This is what Hamlet at this moment wants. Hamlet here is being the man of reason, the man of action, and he's moving forward. Ironically, it's going to take him a bit of time. So, in that sense, he is delaying in seeking vengeance. But, you know, this is a good reason here for Hamlet to delay. It's good for him to be using his human skill, his brain, to think clearly, to think sensibly, logically. Hamlet, as I said here, is a man with a plan, a rational man with a plan. But as we're going to see in Act 3, when we meet Hamlet again, we're going to find him once more in a state, he'll be lost in thought. He'll be in one of these introspective moods of his. And he'll be thinking once more, he'll be reflecting on existence, the meaning of existence, on life and on death, and particularly on suicide, because we're going to meet him next in the most famous of all his soliloquies, the To Be or Not To Be soliloquy. And that opening line, to be or not to be, that is the question. That I'm fairly confident that's probably, yeah, that's the most well-known line in all of literature. I would think everyone practically has heard of to be or not to be. That is the question, and that it will be the question that we will address next time when we meet Hamlet in Act 3. Uh, uh, Scene 2, Act 3, Scene 1. We'll meet him again in this, we'll meet the melancholy Dane again, this brooding, introspective figure, wondering to be or not to be. What is the answer to that question? Be gone.